everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is Ethically Speaking, a case study on authorship and publication. Our presenter today is Dr. Yoka Brott from Creative Arts Therapies, and then our case study discussion leaders are Zach Hathaway, Connie Perry, and Roseanne DiMaria Galili. Now, without further ado, let me throw it over to Zach Hathaway to introduce himself and everybody else on the panel. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you very much, and welcome again to everyone for joining us today for our presentation on our Ethically Speaking series. For this presentation, we are so thrilled to have Dr. Yoka Brott as our guest speaker, who's going to be talking to us about authorship and publication. Dr. Brott is a professor and program director for the PhD in Creative Arts Therapies program and a board-certified music therapist. We are also joined by Dr. Roseanne DiMaria Galili, who's the Associate Dean for Interprofessional Research and Development in the college, and Dr. Connie Perry, who is an associate professor with extensive experience in the field of ethics. And then there's myself, Zach Hathaway. I'm a project manager for research in the college, and I have a background in compliance and research oversight. So, with that, for this series, we focus on different areas of responsible conduct of research, which is sometimes also called research integrity. And this has been taken up by institutions such as the NIH and the NSF into their policies. The NIH has also implemented requirements for the instruction and ongoing training for responsible conduct of research, and this series was developed to meet those requirements. I've also provided an outline of the series, so you can see all of the upcoming sessions, and our next session, which will be in the spring term, week 9, is going to be on collaborative research with collaborating with industry as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Brott to begin the discussion. But first, I think we have a short poll that we're going to launch. It should pop up before you, so you can just check off which of these, select all that apply, and then you can hit submit and it'll show us. With that, we can move ahead and take it away.
So welcome everyone. So today we have a really broad ethical topic, or RCR topic, namely authorship ethics and publication ethics. And I want to start off today's presentation by letting you know that there's no way that we can cover all possible ethical issues, or even the most important ones, because there's so many ethics or ethical issues that can pop up as you consider authorship for your papers, and certainly once you start engaging in publishing your papers or in peer reviewing papers. So we decided to just bring forth a couple of important ones, but we're also very open to hearing from you, your experiences. So we're going to start with some authorship related issues or considerations, and then each time I'll bring it back to the group to see if any of you have had any experiences with this, or any questions that you considered as you're trying to determine maybe who should be authors on some papers that you're leading, or whether you should be considered to be an author on something that you've contributed to. And I also want to let you know, because I'm looking at the PowerPoint, I don't see all of you up right now, and many of you have your videos off anyway. So please feel free to jump in anytime with questions. And if it would become that we have too many questions coming in and we're not getting to the next slide, that at that moment I might tell you, let's hold off, let's get to a few more things, and then we'll open it up for questions again. But please, I want this to be very interactive, so feel free to just start speaking. You don't have to raise your hand, because I may not even see that your hand is raised, so just feel free and jump in. So the first thing I want to bring to this group is issues around authorship. And so the poll that you were just sent was asking about, what do you think are the criteria for authorship? So how can you determine whether somebody deserves authorship or not? But really important, in order for anybody to be considered or be considered for authorship, first of all, that person, of course, need to have done substantial contributions to either the concept or the design of the work or of the research study, or have been involved with the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data work. They also need to have been involved with drafting of the manuscript or revising it critically. So sometimes people think that all authors need to have written parts of the manuscript. That is not always true. That's sometimes how it works, but sometimes it's one or two authors taking the lead on actually writing, sending it out to the other people that you're considering for authorship, asking them for critical feedback or revise, certain sections. So as long as somebody is substantially involved in reviewing then the draft manuscript and suggesting revisions, that is important. They all need to give final approval of the version to be published. And very importantly, they need to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So that if there's any issues related to integrity, accuracy, they need to be able to basically stand for the work and know that what is presented is accurate, or be able to support the integrity of the work. So, and these are the ICMG authorship guidelines, is the International Council of Medical Journals Editors or Ethics. So I wanted to check in with you because when I interact with students, very often students come with questions to me about authorship. And I wanted to get a sense if any of you have experienced yourself issues around determining whether somebody should be authored or not, or maybe if you have been yourself overlooked for authorship, where maybe you felt that you were deserving of authorship.
So when I first started my PhD, my advisor gave me data to analyze, and then we subsequently wrote a manuscript based on that data. And it was data that she had from actually a previous research methods class. A discussion that we had was how do we appropriately recognize those students who were involved in the data collection process, but had since graduated and hadn't done anything in terms of the data analysis and the actual writing of the manuscript. So I think she consulted maybe a few different people on how we should handle that. And ultimately what we did was we, in the acknowledgements section at the end of the manuscript, we acknowledged those students. And the same thing came up for part of my dissertation work. I had someone that helped me conduct one of the focus groups. And again, we acknowledged her at the end of the manuscript.
Yeah, those are two really good examples, because participation in the study as a research assistant or any participation in the study does not automatically qualify you for authorship. Really, all of these bullet points all of these criteria need to be present. So the example of the data that were collected in a prior class, Melissa, if those students had collected the data and they had been involved with the data analysis and the interpretation, then it would have been ethically responsible to invite those students to be co-authors, but only if they then indeed get involved with either writing the manuscript or critically reviewing it, giving feedback on the manuscript, and then the final 2 points. So just having them collected, having just the mere fact that they collected the data does not qualify for authorship. So the next best thing is, like, if they were only involved with collecting the data, but not analysis, not interpretation, then probably what your advisor suggested to acknowledge them in the acknowledgement section is the next best thing to do, or sometimes the only appropriate thing to do. I think I have it on a later slide, but it is so important when you acknowledge anybody in your acknowledgement section that you ask that person permission to be acknowledged. Because nothing is worse if you suddenly see your name appear in an acknowledgement section and you so do not want to be associated with that manuscript because of the content of the manuscript, the quality of the manuscript, whatever it might be. So please always make sure to ask explicit permission from people to be acknowledged.
Well,
Somebody, Yeah,
Also,
go
as an
ahead.
aside, I'll just follow up because in the manuscript that we just had published, it was in the Foods Journal, and they actually required documentation that the person we acknowledged was giving her approval to be acknowledged.
Yep. I just actually had a personally horrible experience with being acknowledged in a manuscript I didn't want to be associated with. And I'm an editor of a journal. And since that experience, we have instituted the very same thing that we ask, that a bullet point to be ticked at least. Bonnie asked, what do we do if someone doesn't fulfill any of these bullet points mentioned? Bonnie, can you explain? Because if they don't fulfill any of these, why would we be talking about authorship?
Sorry, I wrote any one of this. So what if they don't fill any one of this? So then what should be? Suppose they have contributed to conception and design, but they don't end up giving or revising a critical feedback or drafting. So then what should be the protocol?
Yeah, as per these guidelines, and the same COPE has similar guidelines, then they actually do not qualify for authorship. Now, it is important though that you as a lead author, for example, actively invite those people and actively remind those people in order for them to be author. It would be important that they offer some critical feedback on the manuscript, approve the final draft. Would they like to be an author? If they say yes, then it is important that they fulfill those other criteria. All right, but sometimes I think people forget to invite or forget to pop the question. They say, well, this person only did this, I'm not going to consider them for authorship. Well, maybe you should ask them if they would like to be an author, and then explicitly state what that would involve. Okay. I also want to bring your attention to the fact that we have a policy in our college specifically on student research authorship. And basically, what is outlined here on this slide is the policies specifically related to authorship on your dissertation or thesis manuscripts by anybody on your committee or even your supervising professor. These are, of course, based on the criteria that we just reviewed, but it is important to point out that people on your committee, on your dissertation committee or on your thesis committee, that those people may or may not qualify for authorship, and that none of them should just be given authorship for the mere fact that they served on your committee. So the same criteria count. They need to have either contributed, they need to have given some contribution to the direction and the scope of your research by offering your guidance on your research project. There's typically long-term participation by these committee members in your research project. They might giving you some guidance around your methodology or around specific methods issues that you encountered. They might have had substantial involvement in data verification or analysis or interpretation, and involvement doesn't per se mean that they have analyzed, of course, but that they have given you significant feedback on the analysis of the data or the interpretation. They typically have also contributed towards your manuscript. If you have an article style dissertation, then they typically will have read your manuscript drafts, will have offered significant feedback. So if they have been involved at that level, then you would typically invite them to be a co-author on your manuscript. But if you have, for example, one committee member who has barely contributed, you even wonder if they even read your proposal or your dissertation, then of course that wouldn't qualify for authorship. So I recommend that all of you have discussions with your supervising professor about this early on, and as well towards the end of your dissertation as you defend. So please don't go ahead and invite your committee members to be authors on your manuscripts without first discussing it with your supervising professor as well. And we'll talk in a moment about order of authorship. That too should really be discussed with your supervising author before you extend any invitations. So some really common disputes that we will see is that there is an insufficient contribution to warrant authorship, which is considered gift authorship. So if you give somebody authorship who doesn't deserve it. And the opposite is if you exclude individuals who really deserve authorship credit, and that is considered ghost authorship. That's one form of ghost authorship. But so important when you lead a lab and you have research team members involved with a project in your lab, that you carefully considered, who contributed what to the project and who should be considered or who should you consider inviting for authorship. And then the example that was given earlier, to determine whether somebody should be author or whether it would be better to acknowledge them in the acknowledgement section is something important to consider as well. And then, of course, once you determine who is worthy of authorship or who should be invited to be an author on your paper, the next discussion is then what should be the order of authorship be? And I cannot stress enough how important it is to have that discussion really early on. Ideally, even at the start of the research, there is already some discussion about what manuscripts are you hoping to get out of the study, who should take lead on what, yeah? But certainly, before you write the first letter on a manuscript, you should have a discussion who will be involved in author and what will be the authorship order. So often that discussion comes too late, and that leads to some disappointments or even people being truly upset about the authorship order because assumptions were made on their part that they would be first or second or supervising author, okay? Practices regarding that first and last authorship position really vary across disciplines. In some disciplines, it's better, beside first authorship, which is of course the coveted position, it is best then to have the next best position is second authorship. But in many other fields, in many medical fields, last authorship is considered an important position because that is for your supervising author or your what used to be often called the senior author, right? But the person really is overseeing either the manuscript draft and very often also the project. Yeah, so that's another discussion you need to have and might differ depending on what journal you submit this to. And of course, another issue that we frequently see, and with me, I mean, I'm an editor of a journal, and we sometimes see this come up, or it's a frequent discussion amongst editors, is abuse of power to manipulate authorship. So where somebody might reach out to us that they really have done all the work, but the supervising professor decided that somebody else should be lead author, and it's kind of the supervising professor manipulating the or deciding authorship order because they're in a position of power. All right, so we have we decided to bring two case studies, one around authorship and one around publication, as we typically do in these RCR kind of presentation. So I'll let you read this first one, and then we'll have a discussion about what you think about this. All of these case studies are case studies that have been brought to the COPE forum, and the COPE is a body of what is that? The Council on Publication Ethics. Do I have that correct? Committee on Publication Ethics. And it's a committee that provides guidance to journals as to how to deal with publication-related disputes. And then they have published guidelines as to what you should do when certain disputes take place, what kind of pathways you need to follow in your decision process. But they are often consulted by they might be contacted by an author or by an institution or by a journal editor with some issues that are occurring, and they're seeking advice from what is called the COPE forum as to what should be done. And so these these case studies are published on their websites. There's many case studies published. So you certainly, if you ever look for some good reading material, they're really interesting to read. And they always then list the advice that was offered and the resolution. The next issue up is related to plagiarism. And I know that all of you as students have had to take at one point or another the CNHP plagiarism course on Blackboard and complete a quiz to show your understanding of plagiarism. You also have to typically sign a plagiarism statement or originality statement as you submit your papers. And I think most of you know what plagiarism of language or words involve, right? We've all struggled certainly hard to try to properly paraphrase, things that we read in articles, or make a decision, should we paraphrase, should we quote, when should we do one or the other. So I don't think a lengthy discussion about that is needed here, but what a discussion I do want to bring to you is the idea of plagiarism of ideas. And I don't know if you know what that refers to, if anybody could speak to that. What is plagiarism of ideas? Or what might that refer to, or an example that you might have? I know there's some people on this call here who know very, very well what this is about, given that we just had a major issue with that in our profession. So feel free to speak up.
So I didn't want to take up too much space, but
Yeah, that's okay.
Plagiarism of ideas, just thinking about the example you referred to and that I was referring to earlier is when someone, for example, has presented an idea to a mentor per se, and also has and has discussed this idea with the mentor, and then the mentor takes and publishes the idea as their own without acknowledging the originator of the idea.
Yeah. Very good example. Another example is if you submit a manuscript to a journal, it gets rejected, and a year later, you see almost your exact idea, whether it's maybe a theory that you proposed or something else you published by somebody else, and it turns out that that person was the peer reviewer for your manuscript. That at times happens. Sometimes it's plagiarizing ideas, something that you presented at a conference. It might be, again, a theoretical framework or a very innovative idea that you present at a conference, maybe in a poster or sometimes just in an oral presentation. And a bit later, you see those ideas published somewhere without acknowledgement or citation of your presentation. So those are examples of plagiarism of ideas, and this happens more frequently than you would hope it happens. And I wanted to bring this especially to PhD students and postdocs here on the call, bring this to your attention to make sure that you know how to protect your ideas or to tread carefully as you share ideas with others. And there's some ways that you can protect certainly anything, any innovative ideas, theoretical frameworks that you are presenting, new methodologies for data analysis, whatever it might be, that is in your area of expertise. Make sure that when you present or discuss your ideas that you have some kind of record of that presentation. So for example, if it's a conference presentation, if you know that the conference does not do conference abstracts, doesn't publish conference abstracts, which in some fields doesn't happen, then I would be very careful presenting a very novel or innovative idea there, because you are not going to have much proof per se of that, or make sure that your presentation is recorded so that many conferences now record or ask if presentations can be recorded. So that's another way to have a record of you actually sharing that idea with the public. When you discuss ideas with a potential collaborator, think carefully about how much you share and in what way you share that. If you share that during a telephone call, you have now no proof that you have shared that idea with that person, who might end up not collaborating with you and runs off with the idea, right? Instead, maybe put the idea or a brief summary of the idea in an email to them so that you have email proof. Or after the phone conversation, say, thank you so much for speaking with me. So just to summarize, we discussed, so that you have some kind of proof. And I'm sure there's many other ways that you can think of establishing proof to make sure that your idea has been protected. This is so important. When you discover that your ideas may have been plagiarized, or your words have been plagiarized, what would you do? Does anybody know what to do? What would be the first thing? So you see a publication, you pick up a journal and you read an article. It's of great interest to you because it's on a topic of your scholarship, and to your horror, you discover that you've been plagiarized.
I guess I would contact the journal editor.
Absolutely. Yep, you contact the journal editor. It's very often a first good step because they then will engage the COPE guidelines, which tell them exactly what they need to be doing. And the first step that they will do is actually ask you for proof of plagiarism, meaning, can you show me the manuscript that they plagiarized from, or, whatever evidence that you have. And then they will typically contact the other author to ask them for a response. That response might be acknowledgement, and then they might agree to publish a corrigendum to have this corrected, or it might be that they dispute it, that they deny it, and then COPE guidelines again would help the editor decide what to do next. And so very often the institution then also gets involved to, again, alert them to this issue of plagiarism, and sometimes to help with the investigation. But whenever your ideas or your words or language is plagiarized, it is so important that you dare to act. And to know that there are publishing guidelines that can help you decide what to do next. It is also important, of course, as when you're a student, to immediately connect with your advisor around this. But also, once you graduate, we are still available to you to help guide you in issues like this and provide mentoring. So always reach out. Feel free to reach out to your advisor or to your mentor to get some guidance as to what you should do next. Yeah, Connie.
Yeah, I would also say to be careful with your language when you start it, because sometimes, especially with plagiarism of ideas, sometimes people come up with similar ideas around the same time, and this just happens. Just present evidence, talk about possibilities, and then let the powers that be go through the process of investigation.
Yeah, very good suggestion. very good suggestion. And that's why it's so important to have evidence of what it is that you shared because of this exact reason, because it's also very easy for somebody to then give a rebuttal and say, well, no, I mean, I just happen to think of these same ideas at the same time, which might very well be, but not if you know that you directly shared with that person your ideas, you know, just prior to their publication, right? So yeah, so to be able to establish a timeline, it is so important that you have some, you know, evidence and supporting materials that can back up your claim of potential plagiarism. Yeah, thank you for that. Any questions related to plagiarism or issues that you've seen happen? No. Again, happens quite a bit in my just work as a reviewer of a journal. I've seen a significant plagiarism of my work, 3 instances, and in one instance, an entire review, an entire Cochrane review that was just lifted and just published in another journal with, I mean, word for word from front to back. And of course, that journal asked me to be a reviewer because it was a topic that I had done a Cochrane review on. And I started reading and I was like, well, this sounds very, I mean, of course, it sounded familiar because it's a review that I did as well. But just reading the beginning, the background section was like, that, isn't that exactly the way that I wrote this? And then I go check and it was word for word. It was unbelievable. So yeah, people do that. Go ahead.
So I find that really interesting because most journals now have that software like Turnitin or a more sophisticated version where they do check the similarity index to make sure there is no plagiarism. So how did that slip through the cracks?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So about 10 years ago, that wasn't commonly used yet. And I know that there's publisher like the publisher of our journal, the journal that I edit, Taylor and Francis. They don't use plagiarism software for everything that comes in because it's just it's actually too much manpower because, as you know, sometimes there's 30% coverage, right? But it's little words here, or it's the methodology section that results in a huge coverage rate, but there's no plagiarism. So they typically only engage it if reviewers and or editors suspect that there might be plagiarism. Yeah, so.
I have one quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I was curious, what if something like plagiarism of idea happens with, let's say, a mentor who you shared it with, but don't have an evidence of. So then what would you suggest or recommend?
Wow. So the mentor plagiarizing your ideas?
Yeah, if that's a hypothetical situation.
Yeah. Wow. I would sure hope that would never happen, but I can imagine that might happen. Again, you know, having evidence of your work, right? So the plagiarism of ideas. So let's say it's a new methodology that you propose, you know, do a presentation in the lab, have that presentation recorded, you know, so the same suggestions as what I just gave you, having records of the meetings with a mentor, for example, via an email after a meeting, say, thank you so much for the meeting. I'm so excited, you know, to see your enthusiasm for my idea about that, you know, and you outline the idea. Of course, it's hard to know who would ever suspect that their mentor would plagiarize their ideas, right? So quite honestly, as an advisee, I don't think after every meeting, I would send an email to my mentor to summarize the meeting, but yeah. That is a very difficult situation, you know, and like you said, sometimes these ideas are certainly in a mentoring relationship. I mean, I have that all the time with my students. Students bring forth an idea and then I get excited and how about this? And then the student said, oh, that makes me think, or after a meeting, like, oh, I was so inspired by your conversation and here is something, you know, can we meet again? And we talk more, and none of that is documented. And yeah, then I could run away with that idea. Wow. Bonnie, let's hope not, right?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping that never happens, but
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay. I'll just very quickly review this one because I want to be mindful of time here. Just the issue of submitting to two journals. So as you know, the simultaneous submission to two journals of one of the same manuscript is not allowed, is never allowed, right? However, what sometimes happens is that authors will submit their manuscript to a lower tier journal to receive peer feedback so that they can improve the manuscript, because they always had the intent to try to submit it to a higher tier journal. And what do you think? Is that allowed or not allowed? I see Connie shaking her head no, but I will tell you, this is actually a case study or a couple of case studies on COPE. It is allowed if the authors formally withdraw their journal, their manuscript from the lower tier journal. So after they received peer review feedback, and then they withdraw it, and then they decide to submit it somewhere else. As per publication ethics, that is allowed. However, it is of course frowned upon, because if you think about it within a larger ethical perspective, that is quite problematic, as it really wastes a lot of resources, and it's kind of manipulating a system and using resources to try to get you published in a better level journal. So I certainly would recommend that you don't engage in that practice, but I was very surprised to find that by the letter of the law, or there's no law, but guidelines, ethical guidelines, this apparently is permitted. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I see everybody frowning there. Yeah, so please.
I have one question again, whenever, if possible.
What did you say?
I have one question related to this, but from the publication journals point of view. I don't know if this is the scope of this session, but recently I had a really bad experience where the journal would not give adequate feedback and sort of delayed the manuscript process with constant second review, third review, but no adequate feedback to the author. But they would also not just reject the submission. So do you have any experience on that, and what should your recommendation be? I mean, and ultimately we withdrew our submission, but it wasted a lot of time. It was really frustrating because the peer reviews literally do not give any feedback and were copy pasting the template advice.
Yeah, it's a really good example, Bonnie. And as an author, you always have the right to withdraw your manuscript if there are significant delays in the decision process, or a situation like you just described, where you might get a decision of major revision and you barely receive feedback in the peer review or by the editor. Then you don't know what to revise. And then you're going to get into a process that's just going to delay either the decision to reject or the decision to publish even further. Another situation is where you may get peer review comments which you hugely disagree, and now the question is, okay, are you going to try to write a response letter disagreeing with the comments, right? And so again, further delaying the review process, or do you think that, judging by the tone of the editor's decision letter, that the editor is siding with these reviewers, and that you cannot, whether it's philosophically or methodologically, agree with what the reviewers are suggesting? So then sometimes it's also better to just withdraw your manuscript and publish it somewhere else. But yeah, if you don't get review feedback and you get a decision of major revision, I would say think twice before you resubmit, or contact the editor and say, I really feel that we didn't receive much guidance as to what revisions you are looking for. Can you please clarify? And if they don't respond, then to know that you can always unsubmit or withdraw your manuscript.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. We have a little polling question here for you as well. So Okay, so it seems like we're all over the place a little bit with this one. And I will say that salami or piecemeal publishing is not recommended. And, some people will go as far to say it's never permitted, but it is actually, it is permitted as per COPE guidelines, but under very strict circumstances. It is the recommendation is that really that if you can to report one study in one article, that is definitely the recommended practice. However, we all know that some studies are so complex that given the word limit, it is impossible to get everything published in one article, or you're not going to be able to do justice then to a good in-depth discussion section, for example, discussion of the findings. However, piecemeal publishing in order to just build your CV because you're on tenure track and you want to get 5 publications in, and you have, I'm just going to make this up, a research study. It's on the effect of physical therapy on heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation level, a couple of other physiological responses in X, Y, and Z athletes. It would certainly not be acceptable for you to publish one article on heart rate, one article on oxygen saturation, one article, right? And so it's very easy if you include 6 outcomes in your study and now you make it 6 different publications, that would make it really easy for you to increase your publication record rapidly. That is not permitted. However, sometimes it is needed that you divide your results in 2 different articles to be able to do justice to the detailed reporting that might be needed, or in-depth discussion. If you publish a second article based on the data of that one study, you are required to reference the previously published article. You're also required to clearly state that it is part of an already published study, and that you both articles need to make a statement that only part of the results collected from this larger clinical trial are published within the manuscript, so that the reader, the publisher, anybody who needs to review your work can clearly see that you got 2 publications out of this one study. You are at no time allowed to publish or repeat any of the data that was already presented in the previous article. So the example of the physical therapy study, so let's say you decide to publish one article on heart rate and oxygenation level, then you cannot in a second article say, okay, here I'm going to publish the results of heart rate and respiratory rate because I want to discuss them together for some reason. If that heart rate data was already published in another article, you cannot publish it again. The only thing you can do is reference the previous publication and say, as published in this article, and then you can summarize it, or you can refer to it, but you cannot publish data twice. So that is important to consider as you think about piecemeal publishing. Next slide. And then there's other issues around publication to consider, of course. You've all heard of fabrication of data or falsification of data. Needless to say, that is unacceptable. But also really important is a transparent reporting of methods. So please, as you report on, let's say, a randomized controlled trial or a non-randomized controlled trial, go look at the reporting guidelines that are in existence, and many journals even require that you submit a checklist related to these reporting guidelines. Make sure that you know what you will be expected to report as part of a randomized controlled trial, of course. Selective reporting is also not allowed. So again, physical therapy article, let's say you have great results for respiratory rate and oxygen saturation, but not for heart rate, to then say, I'm not going to publish the heart rate data because it didn't look so good. That is not allowed. And that's why nowadays, well, for a long time already, many journals require that clinical trials are registered in databases, so that you have to pre-register or publicize the outcomes that you collected. And that is to prevent that people afterwards can decide, I'm only going to report on these two outcomes and not on the third outcome, for example. If you would discover any errors in your data after publication, whether it's an error in the data analysis or maybe an error you made in the reporting of your data in a table, maybe a decimal point got moved left or right, please notify the editor about this, and then typically they will publish a corrigendum, and that is done pretty easily and pretty rapidly.